Good evening and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we're getting past the first years of our republic with the Articles of Confederation, and we're going to talk about America in the early 1800s. This is the first half of Section 3, since Section 3 is pretty large, and so we're only going to do and cover topics 1 and 2. Learning targets today are talking about the early years, all the important things like the development of the two-party system, the importance of the Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812, and the Monroe Doctrine, and then we'll talk about Andrew Jackson's presidency from 1828 to 1836. But first off, getting started with our new Constitution, Washington's government included Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton basically wants to start a national bank for the United States because he thinks it will help the economy. And he thinks that the Constitution's elastic clause, or some people call it the necessary and proper clause, gives him the power to do this. And this is the debate that will create our two first political parties almost immediately after the Constitution was created. So you can see here, nice little graphic, kind of sums them all up. The Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton, and they want a strong central government. They want the economy to be based on industry and trade. They are pro-British, and they support a loose construction of the Constitution, which means since it is not prohibited by the Constitution, they are allowed to do it, which is how a lot of people would interpret it. The Democratic Republicans, which turn into the Democratic Party that we have today, are led by Thomas Jefferson. They think the state should have more power. They're basically the leftover anti-federalists. They believe the economy should be based on farming. They're pro-French over pro-British, and they support a strict construction of the Constitution, which means that since it is not a power that is explicitly given to the government to have a national bank, then they are not allowed to charter one. So this is the issue, and this is what brings our first political parties. Foreign policy issues that are going on right after the French Revolution happens, and we stay neutral, and other nations actually declare war on the French government, but we stay neutral since they helped us out in our revolution. The British sailors are actually doing something very illegal. They are seizing our sailors and forcing them to work in their navy, which is a practice called impressment. We also have British forts that are still on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes, and we can't make them leave. John Jay is sent to negotiate, and he signs Jay's treaty with the British, but it only delays the war. The French are offended by this because we have made a treaty with their enemies, the British, and so they begin seizing our merchant ships. So we can't make anybody happy during this first part. And then where we get our namesake, Fort Wayne, General Anthony Wayne is winning Ohio and southern Indiana land away from the Indians at this point and opening up more of the Northwest Territory. When we get into Thomas Jefferson's presidency, in 1803, a very important case happens in Marbury versus Madison, and this is what gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. It's not in the original Constitution, but the Supreme Court thinks that it will help check the power of the government, and they should be able to review the constitutionality of federal law. And so that's mainly what they do today, and it's another check in the system of checks and balances, and the Supreme Court basically gave it to themselves, and nobody's argued with it since. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase is made, and Jefferson buys land from France. But something that's going on here is that Jefferson is a Democratic Republican, and he thinks that we should have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. But nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president can buy land. So Jefferson is kind of saying, do as I say, not as I do here. And he buys land from France for $15 million, but it doubles the size of the country overnight. And they send Lewis and Clark to explore these new lands. The War of 1812 finally breaks out due to all this tension between the British and the Americans. And so the War of 1812 breaks out. The U.S. tries and fails to invade British Canada. Britain burns the Capitol and the White House, and the U.S. defeat the British in other major attacks. And there's no real winner here, but what happens is that it shows that this democracy is stable, and that we're going to be around for a while, and we're a stable country. So that's what happens, the War of 1812 to 1815. Here is a little cause and effect primer for you. And I won't go over that. You can pause and look at that if you'd like. The Monroe Doctrine, not really important right now in the 1820s, but more so when we get to our age of imperialism toward the 1890s will it be important. Monroe basically declares that European monarchies have no business over here in our side of the world, in the Western Hemisphere. This is our territory. You stay out of our backyard and we'll stay out of your backyard. We don't want Spain to regain her colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and we don't want anybody else taking over any colonies over here. This is our half of the world. We'll deal with it. Now we're to President Andrew Jackson, and just a little background on how tough this guy is. He worked as a courier. He's a young boy during the Revolutionary War, and so he carries messages back and forth, and he's held as a prisoner of war by the British, nearly starves to death. He is the major hero at the final major battle of the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. He's way outnumbered, but he defeats the British there in a series of battles. His political resume means that he's the military governor of Florida after Spain cedes it to the United States. He's the first American president to be born on the frontier. He did not come from a rich family like the other previous presidents did, so he's really a new guy. And he's the first president to be popular with the common man. And this ushers in the era of Jacksonian Democracy. And what this means is that national politics are becoming more democratic during this time. More people are voting due to the fact that there's new rules. And so you don't have to own land anymore. You just have to be a tax-paying white male. Today you don't even have to tax or pay taxes. Anybody can vote as long as you're 18, not a criminal, don't have any intellectual disabilities. Back then, some blacks and all women still cannot vote during this time, but more common people are voting, and so they're going to vote for more people like themselves, like Andrew Jackson. So this is popular for him. He wins the popular vote, but as you know, that's not how we choose the president. So since there's 4 major candidates running in 1824, nobody wins a majority of the Electoral College. So it comes down to the top 3, but the 4th place, Henry Clay, throws his support to John Quincy Adams, and that means Adams wins over Andrew Jackson. And then Adams, once he's president, then appoints Henry Clay Secretary of State. So Jackson claims a corrupt bargain is made, and he starts preparing for 1828, which is one of the nastiest campaigns in history. One party is accusing the other party of their being married to living with their wife before the wife was divorced from the first husband. One party is attacking the other party for providing an young American virgin for the Tsar of Russia in the White House when they were visiting. So there's a lot of mudslinging going on. It's really comparable to today. But Jackson wins, and after this, his wife passes from an unexplained heart attack, probably due to all the stress that was being caused, and her death shapes Jackson's presidency. Now, there's some major events that go on in Jackson's presidency. This first one is the Nullification Crisis. I mean, nullification basically means that you can void something. You can make it not true. You can make it not happen. You can nullify it. You might have heard the phrase null and void. They mean pretty much the same thing. So you got to know what a protective tariff is. A protective tariff is a tax on an import that's designed to protect an American product. So if we have 2 cars and one is an import from Japan and the other is American, if we tax the imported one, you are more likely to buy the cheaper American one. So we can sort of steer you toward American products. And since the Northerners make a lot of their stuff, they approve of this. And the Southerners dislike it because they import a lot of their stuff. So Congress adopts this, and the South calls it the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. John C. Calhoun is a fiery Southerner. He is Jackson's vice president, and he champions the idea of nullification, that if a state disagrees with the law, that they can void any federal law that they deem unconstitutional. Well, Jackson supports states' rights, but he doesn't think that states should be able to nullify any federal law. That way, in this state, we follow this federal law, but not this one. And in this state, it's the opposite. So we'd have a patchwork of laws governing our country. And so Jackson even goes as far as to have Congress pass a newer, less expensive tariff, but it's still unacceptable. Calhoun resigns the vice presidency in South Carolina, does try to nullify the law, and they threaten to secede from the Union or break away from the Union if the federal government collects the tax by force. So Jackson goes ahead and takes action and got the authority to use troops in South Carolina, but thankfully cooler heads prevail. But it is kind of a precursor to the Civil War, this idea of how far does a state have to go to appease the federal government? Do they have to follow all of their laws? The next issue for Jackson is Indian removal. And basically, we want the lands that belong to Indians in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. We want to move them out. And instead of us moving them out and the Indians fighting back, they fight back in court. But the Supreme Court says, and they agree with the Indians, they say that the states cannot remove the Indians, since states do not have the power to deal with foreign nations, and we would consider Indians foreign nations. Congress does. But Jackson says, okay, the Supreme Court has made their decision, now let them go ahead and enforce it. Because they really can't. It's Jackson who is in charge of enforcing law in the country. He's the head of the executive branch. So he removes the Indians in 1830, and he negotiates the peaceful exchange of lands in the South for new lands in the West. Go on out west. There's a ton of land out there. We're not going to need it. Georgia goes ahead and defies the Supreme Court decision, and one of these trails goes horribly wrong, and it ends up being called the Trail of Tears, because 1 out of every 4 Indians died along the way. And this was the Cherokee from their lands in Mississippi to lands in present-day Oklahoma. And here you can see a map. The Trail of Tears is up top. You can see Tennessee through Kentucky, through the southern half of Missouri, all the way out to what is present-day Oklahoma, or what they would call Indian Territory for a long time. And our next issue is the National Bank. The National Bank is, it obviously got chartered from when Alexander Hamilton wanted it. Business leaders agree, and they argue that it spurs economic growth, and Jackson thinks it only serves the rich. And although he is rich, he's a self-made man. So he is a man of the common people. So in 1832, Congress renews the bank's charter, and Jackson vetoes it. So he wants to kill off the bank. And this would form the Whig Party. The Whig Party are supporters of the bank, formed by Jackson's old enemy, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster. And in 1832, they run against each other, and Jackson defeats Clay. This gives him an electoral mandate. It means that people want the bank gone, so he steps up on the attack on the bank by withdrawing federal funds. But this leads to an unstable economy and economic troubles. And in 1836, the voters elect Martin Van Buren president, and he gets all of the economic troubles that Jackson started, and it causes the Panic of 1837, which is the nation's worst economic depression to that point. Land value and sales had dropped. Banks and businesses closed down. City workers in cities face unemployment. Farmers get their land foreclosed on. It's really not a good situation, and the federal government couldn't do much about it because they weren't that heavily involved in regulating the economy at that point. So the Whigs bounce back. People turn to the Whigs to get them out of this economic downturn. And in 1840, William Henry Harrison wins the election. And he wins, and he then dies of pneumonia. after giving an over 2-hour speech in the frigid cold without a jacket. He wanted to prove to people that he was tough, but he dies of pneumonia 1 month into office. He's our shortest lived president. And Vice President John Tyler then becomes president. And that is the first half of lesson 3, first half, America in the early 1800s. Fill out your learning targets, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.